1 month, that's all it takes. The electrical grid fails. Fuel stops moving. Grocery stores empty out in less than 72 hours. Police and emergency services get overwhelmed faster than anyone expects. Millions of people start leaving the cities, with nowhere clear to go. But while most of the country struggles to hold itself together, a handful of states may actually stand a chance. The question is, would yours be one of them? No place on Earth is immune to disaster. Of course, no place is truly invincible. But if any states have the best chance of surviving almost every major disaster scenario, these are the ones that consistently rise to the top, based on water access. Food production, population density, and geography. Not luck, not guesswork, just the numbers. After comparing geography, food production, freshwater access, infrastructure, and population density, 9 states kept rising to the top. Here's the countdown. Our number 9. Maine. Most people write Maine off as just a cold. Out-of-the-way corner of New England. That's exactly the mistake worth correcting. Tucked into the far northeastern edge of the country, Maine has always had a reputation for being a little cut off from everything else. Most of the time, that's treated as a downside. In a real crisis, it flips into an advantage. The state is covered in forest, dotted with thousands of lakes, and home to a population small enough that resources don't get stretched thin the way they would elsewhere. Fresh water isn't something you'd need to go looking for. It's everywhere. Fishing has been a working part of the local economy for generations, not a hobby, which matters a lot when supply chains stop delivering. A lot of Maine's smaller towns already run on local resources rather than depending on some distant distribution hub, which is exactly the kind of setup that holds together when bigger systems don't. The winters are genuinely brutal. No way around that. But that same harshness tends to keep large waves of people from showing up uninvited during an emergency, which is its own kind of protection. Number 8, Idaho. At first glance, Idaho doesn't look like a survival powerhouse, but look closer, and the picture changes fast. Idaho doesn't get much national attention, but people who spend their time thinking seriously about disaster resilience bring it up constantly. Start with the agriculture. Idaho grows an enormous amount of food: potatoes, wheat, dairy, cattle, far more than its own population could ever eat. Add in mountainous terrain that offers real physical protection, along with rivers that keep fresh water flowing through most of the state, and you've already got a strong foundation. Step outside Boise and population density drops off fast, which means fewer bottlenecks if transportation ever breaks down. It's not without weak points. Wildfire risk is real, and it's not going away. But between the food production and the sheer amount of open land, Idaho holds up better than its low profile would suggest. Number 7. Minnesota. Cold weather isn't automatically a liability. Most people assume it is, Minnesota proves. Otherwise, the state's climate actually works in its favor and colder. Regions tend to keep certain diseases and agricultural pests in. Check in ways warmer states don't get to, benefit from. But the bigger story here is water. Minnesota borders Lake Superior and holds more than 10,000 lakes within its own borders. When a crisis drags on for months, that kind of water security isn't a nice-to-have. It's the difference between stability and desperation. On top of that, the state has solid agriculture, real manufacturing capacity, and dependable energy infrastructure. The catch is the winters themselves. They're extreme and without proper heating in place. That same cold that keeps threats away becomes a threat of its own. Number 6. Vermont. Small. Quiet. Easy to overlook if you're only thinking in terms of size or population, but the numbers tell a different story. Vermont consistently ranks among the most self-reliant states in the country. Life here still revolves around small towns rather than sprawling metro areas. Local agriculture is genuinely part of the culture, not an afterthought. And fresh water is never in short supply. The Green Mountains provide a natural buffer, and the forests that cover much of the state offer both timber and a steady source of wildlife. With a smaller population overall, there's simply less competition for whatever resources remain scarce during a prolonged emergency, which, in practical terms, counts for a lot. Number 5. Wyoming, fewer than 1 million people live in Wyoming. That alone should tell you something. Spread across some of the most open land in the country, Wyoming has a resource most states have run out of entirely: room. And in a collapse scenario, that kind of room is worth more than most people realize. The state produces its own energy, raises livestock, and grows enough agricultural product to stand on its own, all without the congestion that comes with denser states. Mountain ranges offer a layer of natural protection, and the sheer distance combined with harsh weather makes Wyoming a genuinely difficult place for large numbers of displaced people to reach. The trade-off is healthcare. Rural access is limited, and that's a real vulnerability if things go on long enough. Still, if self-sufficiency is the priority, Wyoming ranks near the top. Number 4, Montana Big Sky Country earned its nickname long before anyone was thinking about disaster. Resilience. Turns out the name fits for more reasons than one. The same qualities that give Montana its identity also make it one of the strongest long-term survival locations in the country. Massive freshwater systems run through it. Ranches here operate at a scale most states can't match. Population density stays low across almost the entire state. Wildlife remains abundant, and agricultural output is substantial. A lot of preparedness. Researchers point to Montana specifically because its communities already function across huge rural distances. How? Infrastructure for operating independently is already baked into daily life, not something that would need to be built from scratch. Winters are severe, no question, but the resource base underneath all of it goes a long way toward offsetting that risk. Before we get to the top 3, there's one state on this list that surprises almost everyone the first time they see it. And once you understand why it made the cut, it's hard to argue with. Number 3, Wisconsin. Nobody thinks of Wisconsin as a survival state. That's about to change. Wisconsin brings together two things that rarely show up in the same place at this scale: freshwater and food. Bordering 2 of the Great Lakes gives the state access to freshwater reserves most regions could only dream of. Layer on top of that a serious agricultural base: dairy, corn, soybeans, vegetables, livestock, plus a manufacturing sector that stayed relevant for generations. And you get a kind of resilience that doesn't depend on any single industry holding up. If one piece falters, there's enough underneath it to keep things standing. Wisconsin also benefits from a network of smaller cities rather than relying on a single massive urban center. That means resources, manufacturing, and agriculture are spread across the state instead of being concentrated in one location. In a prolonged emergency, that kind of balance can make recovery much easier. Number 2, New Hampshire. New Hampshire almost never comes up in these conversations. It probably should. The state quietly checks nearly every box that matters. Mountainous terrain, dense forest cover, rivers that can be relied on, tight-knit local communities with a long-standing tradition of independence and hands-on local governance. The kind of culture that becomes especially valuable exactly when centralized systems start to buckle. Add in a relatively small population and a location that keeps it at arm's length from most major metro centers. And a lot of the immediate risks that hit denser states simply don't apply here in the same way. Number 1, Alaska, and that brings us to the top of the list. If the conversation is purely about natural resources, almost nothing in the country compares to Alaska. And once you break down exactly why, it's easy to see why this state sits above every other name on this countdown. Start with food. Alaska's fisheries operate on a scale that dwarfs most of the lower 48 combined, supplying a source of protein that doesn't depend on trucked-in supply chains to keep functioning. Add in enormous stretches of timber and wildlife across land that remains, in large sections, essentially untouched, and the state has a food and material base that very few places in the country can match. Then there's water. Alaska holds some of the largest freshwater reserves on the continent, spread across glaciers, rivers, and lakes that have no dependency on municipal treatment systems to remain usable. Energy tells a similar story. Between oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric capacity, Alaska produces far more energy than its own population requires. which means the state isn't standing in line behind anyone else when it comes to keeping the lights on. But the single biggest factor is isolation itself. Alaska's population is small to begin with, and it's scattered across a landmass roughly twice the size of Texas. That combination makes mass migration into the state almost impossible to sustain. There's no highway system capable of funneling large displaced populations in, no easy route by land at all in most directions, and the climate itself acts as a filter, keeping out anyone who isn't already equipped to handle it. That's also Alaska's biggest weakness. The same isolation and extreme cold that keep outside pressure away make ordinary daily life difficult even without a crisis attached to it. Emergency services are thin. Supply runs for fuel and goods that aren't produced locally can take a long time to arrive under normal conditions, let alone in a collapse. This isn't a place that works for everyone, but for people who are already adapted to the environment, already equipped for the cold, and already living with a level of self-sufficiency most of the country has never needed to develop, that isolation stops being a weakness and becomes the whole point. That's why when it comes to surviving a prolonged national collapse, no other state checks as many boxes as Alaska. Final thoughts: no state is untouchable. Every one of them carries its own weak points. Wildfires in one place, floods in another, brutal winters, aging infrastructure, economic strain, or just the plain limits of geography. What actually determines how well someone comes through a crisis has less to do with the state on their driver's license and more to do with what they've done to prepare. Clean water set aside, emergency food, basic medical supplies, real practical skills, neighbors you can actually count on. Those factors, more often than not, end up mattering a lot more than which side of a state line you happen to live on. If you had just 24 hours to leave your state, where would you go? And why? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy realistic survival documentaries backed by geography, infrastructure, and preparedness, not Hollywood fantasy, make sure to subscribe, because we've got a lot more coming. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.